Imagine this. It's September 1st, 1943, at Rabaul Airfield in the South Pacific. The sun is rising, the air thick with heat, and inside a Japanese operations tent, one of the most feared fighter pilots alive is laughing. Why? Because he thinks the Americans have just made another colossal mistake. That pilot was Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai. He had already lost an eye to American gunners, but with his remaining good eye he scanned an intelligence report that morning. A report describing the Americans' brand new fighter. According to Japanese intelligence, it was massive. Heavy as a bomber, wide as a transport. They called it the Hellcat. Sakai chuckled. Another clumsy American design, he thought. Twice the weight of Japan's sleek Featherlight Zeros. Surely it would be no match. But what Sakai didn't know was that this so-called failure of design would, within 30 days, begin to dismantle the very empire of Japanese air power he had spent years building. Through the tent flaps, Sakai could see his squadron Zeros lined up neatly on the runway. Sleek, nimble, and deadly, these planes had ruled the Pacific skies for 2 straight years. The Zero had chewed through everything the Allies had thrown at it. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, Dutch Buffaloes, all of them cut down, one after another. So why would the Hellcat be any different? What Sakai and his fellow pilots couldn't possibly imagine was that this bloated fighter would become their worst nightmare. The F6F Hellcat would go on to achieve a staggering kill ratio of 19-1, taking down over 5,000 enemy aircraft, while losing just 270 of its own in aerial combat. This machine would change the very mathematics of war in the sky. Think about that for a second. Within 6 months, the very pilots who once laughed at the Hellcat's silhouette would be writing their last letters home. For them, meeting a Hellcat in the air wasn't just a fight, it was a statistical certainty of death. And yet, on that hot September morning, the Japanese Navy's confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was earned. Since Pearl Harbor, their numbers had been jaw-dropping. At Pearl they lost just 29 planes, while destroying 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 kills. Over Darwin, only 2 losses against 30 Allied aircraft destroyed. The British Far East Fleet, wiped out. The Dutch East Indies Air Force, gone in days. And at the center of it all was the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that had redefined what was possible in the air. To American engineers, when they first captured and tested one in 1942, its performance seemed like science fiction. A fighter with the range of a bomber, the agility of a biplane, and the firepower to shred anything it caught. No wonder Japan's greatest ace, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who racked up 87 confirmed kills, described it like this in his diary. Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not just control input. American planes, they fly like trucks. But here's the twist. That brilliance, that miracle of design, came with a fatal flaw, and soon the Americans would exploit it. But here's the secret behind the Zero's miracle performance. It wasn't magic. It was sacrifice. No armor plate protected the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks to keep fire at bay. In fact, radios were often removed, just to shave off 30 pounds. Every ounce, every rivet, every drop of fuel was calculated to give the Zero speed and maneuverability at the cost of survival. It was a brilliant gamble, until the Hellcat arrived. In early 1943, the first reports of America's new fighter reached Japanese intelligence. The source? Neutral Sweden. And the numbers looked insane, or maybe even fake. A loaded weight of 12,000 pounds? That was double the Zero's 5,800. A huge radial engine with massive drag. Armor plate everywhere, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks carrying 250 gallons of fuel. To Japanese tacticians, it sounded like the Americans had built a flying tank. Captain Minoru Genda, the mastermind who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, looked at the specs and dismissed them outright. The Americans have learned nothing, he wrote. This Hellcat is just another clumsy machine, trying to overcome skill with hardware. A Zero will fly circles around it. And on paper he wasn't wrong. The Zero's tight wing loading meant it could turn inside nearly anything in the sky. The Hellcat's numbers looked awful by comparison. In a dogfight, it should have been helpless. But then came September 30th, 1943, the day the Japanese finally saw a Hellcat in the flesh. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission near Marcus Island when he spotted 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. At first he thought they were bombers, maybe B-25s on a strange course, but as they turned, he caught sight of their shape. Single engine, stocky fuselage, wings that looked far too short. He realized with a chill what he was seeing, America's new fighter, the F6F Hellcat. Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber, he wrote in his report. Still, Fukui trusted in standard Zero tactics. He rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American plane to blunder straight ahead, while he cut onto its tail. That's when everything he thought he knew unraveled. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't even try to turn. It went vertical, powered by the monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, pumping out 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of the Zero's own engine. The Hellcat shot skyward like nothing Fukui had ever seen. He tried to follow, but his Zero bled speed and struggled against gravity. By 15,000 feet, Fukui was stalling out. Then came the impossible. The Hellcat performed a perfect hammerhead turn, something no aircraft that size should have been able to pull off. It dropped nose first right onto Fukui's tail. At 400 meters, the American opened fire. Not 4 guns, but 6. The sheer wall of bullets shredded through Fukui's Zero. 17 hits in 3 seconds. By throwing his plane into a desperate spin, Fukui barely survived. His aircraft limped back, riddled with holes. His wingman never returned. Neither did the recon plane they were supposed to protect. The Hellcat had drawn first blood. Just 5 days later, the Americans came again. October 5, 1943, Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga of the 252nd Air Group led 12 Zeros to intercept. But this time, the Americans weren't running. They weren't hitting and fleeing. They were waiting, at 20,000 feet. And what happened next would force even the most confident Zero pilots to question everything they thought they knew about air combat. October 5, 1943, Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga and his 252nd Air Group thought they had the Americans exactly where they wanted them. 12 Zeros, high above, with every advantage, altitude, position, surprise. Victory was certain. But what followed shattered Japanese air doctrine in a single battle. As the Zeros dove, the Hellcats didn't scatter. They didn't try to dogfight. They stayed in formation, calm, steady, disciplined. The Zeros opened fire, their bullets stitching through the sky. But instead of falling, the Hellcats just took. Their armor protected the pilots. Their fuel tanks sealed themselves against punctures. Every pound of weight the Japanese had mocked was now saving American lives. And then came the counterattack. The Hellcats didn't try to turn with the Zeros. They climbed, higher, into altitudes where the Zero's engine gasped for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still roared with 1,650 horsepower. The Zero could barely manage 900. From above, the Hellcats dropped like hawks on sparrows. 6 guns blazing, slicing through Zeros before they could react. 8 Japanese fighters fell from the sky. Not a single Hellcat was lost. The prophecy of what would one day be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had begun. A month later, at Rabaul, Japanese pilots gathered for a briefing. At the front stood Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanamizu, a veteran with 32 victories, and one of the few to have survived multiple encounters with the Hellcat. His words stunned the room. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans have changed the rules. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Tanamizu explained what was becoming fatally obvious. The Hellcat wasn't built to turn with the Zero. It was built to never need to. The Americans had mastered a new style of combat, energy fighting. They attacked in slashing dives, using speed and altitude as weapons. They fought in pairs, one high, one low, and thanks to radios, the Japanese had once mocked, they coordinated with flawless precision. "We fly as individual samurai," Tanamizu said. "They fight as a machine. And that machine was only getting deadlier." By December 1943, the cracks were undeniable. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the very man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now served as Air Operations Officer, inspecting crippled Zeros returning from combat. He saw the truth written in bullet holes. The disparity in firepower wasn't just obvious. It was mathematical. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns spat out 4,500 rounds per minute, each bullet carrying 5 times the energy of a Zero's weak 7.7 mm rounds. American guns didn't just damage Zeros, they shredded them. And then came something even more terrifying: radar. While Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight, the Hellcats were being guided by shipboard radar controllers, who could track aircraft 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described his first encounter with this invisible advantage. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning. No visual contact. They were already diving, perfectly positioned, as if they knew exactly where we were. The Americans could see in the dark. The Japanese were blind men, with swords, facing enemies armed with rifles. And perhaps the greatest disaster of all wasn't the machine, but the men. Before the war, Japan's pilot training was legendary. Naval aviators spent 3 years preparing, logging 700 flight hours before their first mission. They weren't just soldiers. They were aerial artists, taught the philosophy of combat as much as the mechanics of it. But by January 1944, the Empire was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. Training had been slashed to the bone. New naval aviators entered combat with 300 hours, Army pilots with just 200. Fuel shortages meant many trained in gliders. Some fired no more than 50 practice rounds before being sent into combat against the Hellcat. The golden generation of Japanese pilots was gone. In their place came boys, brave, but tragically unprepared, and when they met the Hellcat, the outcome was inevitable. By 1944, the Japanese pilot corps was collapsing. Training had been gutted to the bone. Formation flying, instrument training, even basic radio procedures, all cut to rush men to the front. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived with at least 300 hours of flight time, including 50 hours in the Hellcat itself. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, drilled carrier landings until they were muscle memory, and perfected energy tactics in the safety of Texas skies. The contrast was devastating. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer, captured the tragedy in his final report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." One example haunted him. Ensign Yamamoto rushed to the front lines without ever firing his guns in flight, without night training, without even the fuel for practice. His combat career lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes before he was gone. October 1944, the Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome threw everything he had into stopping American carrier raids. Over 700 aircraft, including Japan's last fully trained pilots, were committed. Japanese reports declared victory. 26 carriers and battleships sunk, 300 American planes destroyed. Tokyo celebrated. But the truth, revealed days later, was catastrophic. Actual American losses, 89 aircraft. Japanese losses, 329 planes, and almost every experienced pilot left alive. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few survivors, wrote later, "The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below. They had divided the sky into grids. It was not combat. It was systematic extermination, but nothing compared to what happened in June 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan threw in its reconstituted carrier force, 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, and the last of its veteran aviators. Against them, Task Force 58, with 15 carriers, and nearly 1,000 planes, almost half of them Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed Japanese skill, and the Zero's range would turn the tide. At 8:30 a.m., his first strike of 69 aircraft launched. But American radar picked them up at 150 miles. The Hellcats were waiting. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the escort, described the sight. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them, a steel curtain in the sky. We were at 18,000. Every advantage was theirs. The engagement lasted just 12 minutes. Out of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were destroyed. On that day, Commander David McCampbell shot down 7 enemy planes. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, shot down 6. McCampbell later explained the tactic. "The Zeros tried to turn with us. We simply refused. We made high-side runs, shot one down, zoomed back to altitude. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off." By nightfall, the Japanese had lost 346 carrier aircraft, plus another 50 land-based planes. American losses, just 30 aircraft from all causes. It was so one-sided. That evening, exhausted Hellcat pilots gave it a name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Zeros had been as helpless as game birds, and yet Japan wasn't finished. Just months later, October 24, 1944, the Imperial Navy made its last desperate gamble at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. And once again, the Hellcat would be at the heart of it. Imagine climbing into the cockpit, outnumbered 8-1, and coming out without a scratch, while 9 enemy planes burn in the ocean below. Sounds impossible, right? For Commander David McCampbell, it was just another day in the Pacific. But this wasn't just about one man, it was about a machine that reshaped the very meaning of air combat. The F6F Hellcat, McCampbell's legend, was cemented during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. With only 7 Hellcats, against a swarm of 60 Japanese aircraft, he personally racked up 9 kills in 90 minutes. His wingman, Roy Rushing, added 6 more, 2 men, 15 kills, and here's the jaw-dropper. Not a single American plane was lost. I ran out of ammunition, McCampbell later said, almost casually. That's how complete the dominance was. This wasn't just a turning point, it was a psychological earthquake. Japanese survivors called it Hellcat psychosis. They weren't fighting pilots anymore. They were fighting an industrial machine. Admiral Ozawa admitted it himself. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were engaging not planes, but a system. By 1945, the situation was so dire that Japanese Navy pilots were sent into combat after just 40-50 hours of training. The infamous kamikaze pilots, many had barely a week's worth of flight time. At Okinawa, the Japanese unleashed nearly 2,000 suicide attacks. The Hellcats answered with brutal efficiency. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia and his squadron invented what they called the mowing machine. 4 Hellcats, flying side by side, sweeping through enemy formations, like a scythe through grass, cold, mechanical, unstoppable. The result, Hellcats prevented 80% of kamikazes from ever reaching their targets. And the technology gap, it was a canyon. By late 44, the Hellcat was sporting water injection for over 2,200 horsepower, rocket launchers, upgraded armor, and a gunsight that calculated deflection automatically. Even Japan's greatest ace, Saburo Sakai, admitted the nightmare. He threw every maneuver he had, loops, rolls, dives, but the Hellcat stayed glued to him like a shadow. He only survived because the American forgot to drop his fuel tank. By war's end, the numbers told the brutal truth. Over 5,200 enemy aircraft destroyed. A staggering 19-to-1 kill ratio. 305 new American aces. And the near total destruction of Japan's naval air force. Out of 80,000 Japanese naval aviators who started the war, fewer than 100 combat veterans survived. The kamikaze program was Japan's desperate answer to the Hellcat. Vice Admiral Onishi put it bluntly. If a Zero fought conventionally, it had no chance. If it became a bomb, at least the pilot's death had meaning. That's how far the Hellcat had pushed them, into turning pilots into weapons. Even Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's most celebrated ace, couldn't escape. After scoring his final kills against Hellcats, he died not in a dogfight, but as a passenger, shot down by the very plane he had once bested. And when the war ended, the first American planes to land in occupied Japan were Hellcats. Japanese pilots, engineers, and mechanics lined the runway, staring at the machine that had shattered their world. One ace, Robert Vracue, casually showed off loops and rolls that would have ripped a Zero apart. Then came the gut punch. This isn't even pushing it, he told them. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the man who designed the Zero, examined the Hellcat after the war. His verdict was chilling. We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age. Grumman's factories were rolling out a new Hellcat every 60 minutes. Japan could only watch in disbelief. Their pilots were fighting swordsman's duels, while America was building an assembly line for war. The Hellcat didn't just win battles, it rewrote naval warfare. Carriers went from vulnerable strike platforms to floating fortresses. Admiral Mark Mitcher summed it up best. With the Hellcat, we don't need to find them first. Let them come. In the end, it wasn't just about horsepower or guns. It was about philosophy. Japan fought with spirit, tradition, and sacrifice. America fought with systems, industry, and overwhelming force. And when the smoke cleared, even Saburo Sakai, Japan's most respected ace, admitted it. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. And that difference, fighter versus system, decided the Pacific.